Imagine this. You were living in the year 330 AD. Christianity is not yet the official religion of Rome. In fact, in many parts of the Roman Empire, being a Christian is still dangerous. People are hiding their faith, meeting in secret, afraid of what might happen if they are found out. Now, while all of that is happening in Rome, on the other side of the world, there is a king, a real king, with an army, with a throne, with the power to decide what an entire nation believes. And that king has already chosen Christianity, not privately, not secretly, but publicly, out loud, as the official foundation of his kingdom. Let me ask you something before we go any further. What if the story of how Christianity spread is not the story we were taught? What if instead of beginning in Rome and spreading outward, it was already taking root somewhere else first, somewhere in Africa? His name was Ezana, and he ruled a kingdom called Aksum, which most people today have never heard of. But here is what makes this so interesting. This was not a small, isolated place. This was not some forgotten corner of the ancient world. Aksum was one of the most powerful kingdoms of its time. It controlled major trade routes, it had one of the strongest military forces in the region, and it was mentioned by ancient writers and travelers as one of the great powers of the world. And the king of that empire decided to make Christianity the faith of his people, before Rome did. So the question is this: how did that happen? Why did it happen? And why do so few people know about it today? Here is a question worth thinking about. When you hear the phrase, the spread of Christianity, what image comes to your mind? Rome, the Vatican, Europe. Now what if that image is incomplete? Stay with me, because what we are about to go through is not just a history lesson. It is a reminder that the story of humanity is far bigger, far older, far more connected than any single textbook can hold. Because if this story is true, then Christianity did not just spread from Rome outward. It may have been growing somewhere else first. Let us start at the beginning. To understand Ezana, you first have to understand where he came from, because the Kingdom of Aksum was not a background character in ancient history. It was a main character. Aksum was located in what is today northern Ethiopia and Eritrea. Sit with that geography for a moment. This is a region that sits at a crossroads: Africa to the west and south, the Red Sea to the east, Arabia just across the water, Egypt and the Mediterranean world to the north. You could not have designed a more strategic position if you tried. And because of that position, Aksum controlled trade, not small local trade, major international trade. Ivory, gold, frankincense, myrrh, salt, obsidian, rare goods. These moved through Aksumite territory on their way between Africa, Arabia, India, and the Roman world. Roman coins have been found in Aksum. Indian goods have been discovered there. Greek inscriptions were carved into Aksumite monuments. This was a kingdom that was deeply connected to the wider ancient world. An ancient travel document known as the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, written by a Greek-speaking author in roughly the 1st century AD, described Aksum's port city of Adulis as one of the most important commercial harbors in the region. And writers from that era described Aksum as one of the 4 great empires of the world, the other 3 being Rome, Persia, and China. 4 great empires, and Africa had one of them. Now, does that change the image you had in your mind of ancient Africa? I want you to think about that for a moment, because many people, when they hear ancient Africa, think of something isolated, something cut off from the rest of the world. But Aksum was the opposite of that. It was a hub, a center, a place where the world came to trade, negotiate, and connect. Aksum also had its own writing system called Ge'ez, which is still used in Ethiopian church liturgy today. It had monumental architecture, massive stone obelisks called stelae, some of the tallest ancient stone structures ever carved by human hands. Some of them still stand today. It had a functioning currency system, a sophisticated administration, and the military power to expand its territory across the Red Sea into parts of Arabia at certain points in history. This was not a kingdom on the edges of the ancient world. It was one of the engines of it. So here is the question that now becomes much more interesting. When a kingdom this powerful, this connected, this strategically important decides to change its religion, is that a purely spiritual decision, or is there something more complicated happening? That is the question historians have been asking for decades, and at the center of that question was one young king. Ezana came to the throne of Aksum when he was still young. Some historical accounts suggest he may have been very young when he first became king, which meant the early years of his reign were guided and shaped by those around him. Before Christianity, Aksum was a polytheistic society. The people worshipped multiple gods. Marem, the god of war, was among the most important. There were also deities associated with the sky, the earth, and water. For generations, Aksumite kings had honored these gods in their royal inscriptions. They called themselves sons of Marem. They gave credit to the old gods for their victories in battle. This was the tradition. This was how it had always been done. And this was the world Ezana was born into. He didn't grow up with Christianity, which makes his later decision even more surprising. So what changed? Here is where the historical record becomes genuinely fascinating. There are accounts, both from Aksumite inscriptions and from early church writings, that describe a man named Frumentius as a central figure in bringing Christianity to Aksum. The story, as it has been preserved in historical sources, goes roughly like this. Frumentius was a young man from the city of Tyre. He was traveling by sea with a relative when their ship was stopped near the Aksumite coast. Most people on board did not survive, but Frumentius did, and he was eventually brought to the royal court of Aksum. Over time, he became trusted. He rose to a position of influence in the court, and according to the accounts, he eventually became a teacher and advisor to the young Ezana. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is the kind of detail that historians continue to examine. Exactly how much influence Frumentius had, exactly how direct his role was, is still a matter of academic discussion. But what is agreed upon by historians, and what is supported by physical evidence, is this. Ezana's inscriptions changed over time. Early in his reign, his inscriptions credit the old gods, Marem, the traditional deities of Aksum. Later inscriptions reference the Lord of the Heavens, a phrase consistent with early Christian expression. And eventually, the inscriptions change even more clearly. Now let me ask you this. What does it take to change a belief system that has been passed down for generations? Is it enough to simply meet someone with a different idea? Is it a gradual process, a moment of decision, or something else entirely? Because what Ezana chose to believe would soon affect far more than just himself. At some point in the 330s AD, Ezana made a decision that would permanently alter the course of Aksumite history. He publicly accepted Christianity, not quietly, not as a private matter, but as a matter of state. And here is what that looked like in practice. The royal coins of Aksum changed. Earlier Aksumite coins featured the crescent and disk, symbols associated with the traditional religious system of the kingdom. After Ezana's conversion, the coins began to feature the cross. This is not a small detail. Coins were the most widely circulated objects in the ancient world. They passed through the hands of merchants, soldiers, traders, and ordinary people across every corner of the kingdom and beyond. Putting the cross on a coin was one of the most powerful public statements a king could make. It was saying, without words, "This is who we are now." The royal inscriptions also changed. Where earlier inscriptions praised Marem and the traditional gods, later inscriptions began with language like "in the faith of God" and references to the Trinity. These were not small adjustments in wording. They were fundamental shifts in how the king defined his identity, his authority, and the source of his power. He didn't just convert quietly, he changed the direction of an entire kingdom. Now here is the debate that historians have engaged with when studying this period. Was this a genuine personal transformation, a true change in belief, or was it a political calculation? Think about it from the perspective of a ruler. Aksum had close trading relationships with the Roman world. Christianity was growing in importance across the Mediterranean. Making Aksum a Christian kingdom could have strengthened those relationships. It could have positioned Aksum as a natural ally in a world where shared religion increasingly meant shared political interest. Some scholars emphasize the political dimensions of this decision. Others focus on the personal and spiritual elements. Many suggest it was likely both at the same time, which, honestly, is how most major historical decisions work. If you were a king in that position, what would have driven your choice? Would it have been faith, strategy, a combination of the two? These are not questions with clean answers, and that is part of what makes this story so rich. What we do know is the result. Aksum became a Christian kingdom, and this happened before Rome made the same choice. Let us get the timeline clearly in front of us, because this is where the story becomes historically significant in a way that many people have simply never been told. The Roman Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan in 313 AD. This edict granted religious tolerance throughout the Roman Empire. It made it legal to practice Christianity, but it did not make Christianity the official state religion of Rome. That came later. Theodosius I declared Christianity the official state religion of Rome in 380 AD. Now, Ezana's conversion to Christianity is generally placed by historians somewhere in the 330s AD. So let us think about what that means. While Rome was still in the process of deciding its relationship to Christianity, while Constantine was navigating the politics of religious change across a vast empire, Aksum had already chosen. While Rome was still deciding what to do with Christianity, Aksum had already chosen.
Now, I want to be precise here, because history deserves precision. Constantine himself appears to have personally favored Christianity from around 312 AD onward, and the relationship between the Roman Empire and the Church was evolving throughout the first half of the 4th century. So this is not a simple case of saying one came entirely before the other. But what the historical record does support is that Aksum's formal adoption of Christianity as a state religion, as reflected in its royal inscriptions and coinage, appears to have occurred roughly in parallel with, or even slightly before, Rome's full formal adoption of Christianity as official imperial religion. This is not a minor footnote. It means that when we tell the story of how Christianity became a world religion, the story includes Africa, not as a place that eventually received Christianity from elsewhere, but as a place where that transformation was happening at the same time, possibly even leading the way in some respects. Does that change how you think about this history? Because I think it should raise a question. If Africa was part of this story from such an early point, why is that not a central part of how we teach this history? And that question leads to something even more interesting. Let me be careful here. I am not going to tell you there was a deliberate conspiracy to hide the history of Aksum from the world. History is not usually that simple. But there are real and identifiable reasons why the story of Aksum did not become as central to the popular narrative of early Christianity as the story of Rome, and those reasons are worth understanding. The first is simply the question of which empires survived and which did not. The Roman Empire, even as it transformed into the Byzantine Empire and eventually dissolved, left behind an enormous documentation trail. Its language, Latin, became the foundation of European languages. Its church structures became the institutional backbone of Christianity in Europe. Its historians, its theologians, its legal traditions were preserved, copied, translated, and studied for centuries. Aksum's story was different. The kingdom eventually declined, facing pressures from multiple directions over several centuries. The trade routes that had made it wealthy shifted. The political landscape of the region changed, and as Aksum declined, its story was not picked up and preserved by the same large-scale documentation systems that preserved Rome's story. The second reason is about geography and access. For most of the medieval period and the early modern period, European scholars had limited direct access to the historical records of the Horn of Africa. The documents, inscriptions, and traditions that preserved Aksumite history were largely held within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which had its own unbroken tradition but was not part of the European intellectual mainstream. History doesn't always ignore things on purpose. Sometimes it just focuses on what became dominant later. And what became dominant later, in global terms, was European Christianity with Rome at its center. That is not a statement of blame. It is a description of how historical narratives tend to form. The version that gets told most widely is often the version told by those who had the most lasting institutional power. But here is the question that follows from that. If we have been learning history through a lens that was shaped by specific institutions and regions, how many other stories exist that are just as significant, just as real, but simply less visible in the version most of us were taught? How many chapters are missing from the story we think we know? Even a smaller story can change how we see the bigger one. So what do we do with all of this? What does it mean practically and historically that Aksum adopted Christianity so early, and that this happened in Africa before or roughly simultaneously with Rome?
I think it means several things. First, it complicates the simple narrative that Christianity spread from Rome outward into the world. That narrative is not entirely wrong. Roman missionaries and the Roman church structure did play an enormous role in spreading Christianity across Europe and beyond, but it is incomplete. Because what the story of Aksum shows us is that Christianity was not moving in just one direction. It was not a single line from one origin point. It was multiple centers developing at the same time. Different communities, different kings, different cultures, encountering this faith and making their own decisions about it. It wasn't a single path, it was multiple paths happening at the same time. Egypt had a Christian community among the earliest in the world, with the Coptic tradition tracing its origins back to the evangelist Mark in the 1st century. Ethiopia's Christian tradition, connected to Aksum, developed in close relationship with Egyptian Christianity and has been unbroken for roughly 17 centuries. That is one of the longest continuous Christian traditions on earth, longer than many traditions that are far more famous in popular culture. Second, the story of Aksum challenges us to think about what we mean when we say something is historically significant. Significance is often assigned after the fact, based on which events had the most visible long-term consequences in the regions that dominated later global history. But significance does not belong only to the winners of later centuries. What Ezana did in Aksum in the 330s AD was significant for the people of that kingdom. It shaped their culture, their law, their identity in ways that can still be traced today. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is one of the oldest Christian churches in the world. Its liturgy, its traditions, its scriptures in Ge'ez are a direct inheritance of the decision Ezana made over 1,600 years ago. That continuity is remarkable. And third, this story asks us to think about how we engage with history going forward. Do we learn history as a series of events centered on certain places, certain empires, certain languages? Or do we recognize that the human story was always happening everywhere, on every continent, with depth and complexity and consequence? Maybe that is the part most people never stop to think about. Let us come back to where we started. Before Rome accepted Christianity, an African king had already made his choice. His name was Ezana. He ruled the Kingdom of Aksum, one of the most powerful and strategically important empires of the ancient world. He was raised in a polytheistic tradition. He came into contact with new ideas and new influences, and at some point in the 330s AD, he made a decision that changed everything. He adopted Christianity, he put it at the center of his kingdom, he changed the coins, he changed the inscriptions, he changed the identity of his entire nation, and he did this before the Roman Empire made the same choice official. Now, I am not here to tell you that Aksum is more important than Rome in the history of Christianity. That is not what this story is about. What this story is about is completeness. It is about recognizing that the full picture of how Christianity became a world religion includes Africa, includes Aksum, includes Ezana. And when we leave those pieces out, we are not telling the full story. We are telling a partial one. So what do you think? Was the adoption of Christianity by Aksum just a lesser-known footnote in history? Or is it a missing piece of a much bigger story? Drop your answer in the comments. Do you believe Christianity spread outward from a single center, primarily Rome, or do you think it developed in multiple places at the same time? And if the history of this era had been documented differently, with Aksum's story given the same attention as Rome's, how do you think that would have changed our understanding of early Christianity today? There is no single right answer to that question. Historians themselves continue to debate it. But the conversation matters, because this is the kind of story where the more you look, the more questions appear. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if this is the kind of history that makes you see the world a little differently, there is more where this came from, because history is always bigger than the version we were handed, and sometimes all it takes is one story you never heard before to open a door you did not know was there.